Now, I freely admit that I adore hot hatchbacks, both big and small, because there's something so naturally rebellious about their nature, don't you think? I mean, after all, they're based on cars that are meant to take you to the supermarket or the children to school, but here they are rocking up with the performance of a sports car. This is the new Cupra Leon, and it's so rebellious that it's abandoned its own brand. Okay, so a quick explainer for anybody who is unfamiliar with the badge on the nose of this car. Cupra used to be the sporty element of Seat, but a bit like how DS broke away from Citroën, Cupra is now its own thing, and it represents a more hardcore, more design-focused variant of other Seats, but also bespoke cars like the Formentor. You're probably familiar with the new Seat Leon, and that's exactly the bones that Cupra have used to build this car. But as you can tell, this thing looks considerably more sinister than any regular Leon you've ever seen before. To say this hot hatch has attitude would be a bit of an understatement. I mean, it wears such a scowl on the front of its face. Look at these really angular headlights that sweep down into that big, wide graphite grille that proudly wears the Cupra logo in copper. Then you've got these really strong rakish lines that sweep back along the bonnet, giving it a really sort of muscular stance up front. Something that's quickly worth mentioning is that this is a really early look at the Cupra Leon in the UK, hence why it's on Spanish plates and left-hand drive, and some spec elements we can't have, at the moment at least. So things like this matte blue paint, it's called petrol blue, it's gorgeous, but sadly not available in the UK. Same for this design of 19-inch alloy wheel, which is a shame because in copper they look magnificent, they fill the arches really nicely, and that two-tone colour combination continues to give it a really unique character. I think it's safe to admit that everything between the A and C pillar is pretty much Seat Leon, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's got this nice one sharp line that runs straight through it, and again, in this petrol blue, that shows up the design work really nicely. Just above that pin-sharp shoulder line, you've got quite a sizable boot spoiler that leads down to a really intricate concave shape for the boot lid. As well as some nice signature lighting and the obligatory Cupra badging, there's quad exhausts at the back and a neat little diffuser to finish the design. I actually think Cupra have really hit the nail on the head in terms of design with this Leon, because it struck a really fine balance between something aggressive and sporty, but also premium and quite unique. That flair for theatrics continues on the inside, where you'll find a distinctive cabin. A highly sculpted, textured dashboard draws your eye along the car and down onto lower tiered elements, again finished with interesting details. The copper theme continues throughout, which I have to say I really like, both in terms of the stitching and around the vents. And the sporty flat-bottom steering wheel with start-stop button and Cupra mode selector sets a really sporty tone in here. There's also a set of quite prominent sports seats. Of course, emblazoned with the Cupra logo and copper stitching, but while the big bolsters are good for holding you in place, but more importantly, they're not so aggressive that they're uncomfortable on longer trips. Now, it's fair to say that below the knee, material quality drops off. There's a fair few hard, scratchy plastics dotted around. Could have been swapped out for something a bit plusher. And whilst we're talking about dislikes, let's throw in that 10-inch infotainment display, because it's the same thing that you find in the Golf and a lot of other Volkswagen products, and you've heard me and everybody else say it a million times, it is just not very ergonomic. Graphically very impressive, the screen is a very good size, but the haptic buttons and menu-laden system is just a faff to use. Thank goodness for Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. The rear bench seats 3, with the outermost passengers actually having loads of legroom and pretty generous headroom too. Sadly, the middle passenger draws the short straw, having to straddle a sizable transmission hump. Open that sculpted boot lid to reveal 380 litres of space. That's more space than you'd find in a Golf GTI. It's nice and wide and quite deep, although there is a notable load lip. I think it's fair to say both inside and out, Cupra designers are really making a statement here. Now, there's not too much point doing a really deep dive on specification on this specific car because we've pinched this one from Spain, hence why the steering wheel was on the wrong side. But as soon as we get right-hand drive cars, we'll do a full UK review for you. What I can tell you is that you can have the car in 3 different flavours. There's a 242 brake horsepower sort of detuned entry-level version of the car. There's a hybrid, and then there's this, the big boy, the 300 TSI. Under the bonnet, you'll find a 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder engine with 296 brake horsepower and 400 glorious Newton-meters of torque. Now, if those numbers sound familiar, it's because they're identical to that of the Volkswagen Golf GTI Clubsport, of which it shares this EA888 engine, which is quite familiar to anybody who's driven fast Golfs before. It will likely come as no shock whatsoever that plenty of GTI Clubsport parts have found their way under the skin of this car. But that's no bad thing, because all that performance potential being channeled to the front wheels exclusively will equate to a 0 to 62 mile per hour time of just 5.7 seconds. That equals the Honda Civic Type R and is only 0.1 of a second behind the Golf GTI Clubsport. Though, actually thinking about it, I think there might be some office politics at play here as to the official figures, because this thing feels properly rapid. It's not so much the outright power, it's the really guttural torque that's available from low in the rev range, and the car pulls really cleanly through the revs. It builds up momentum at quite a pace, but it retains quite a stable platform. Here in the UK, as I film this, it stopped raining about an hour ago, so the roads are just starting to dry up, but they're greasy in places. And I love this sort of territory for front-wheel drive, powerful hot hatchbacks, because it really shows you what's what. How well does it get its power down? How does the chassis behave when there's not as much grip available? And what's the steering telling you? So let's go with the first one then. As I've said before, that surge of torque from the engine is utterly relentless and quite addictive actually. But more importantly, there's not too much in the way of torque steer. The wheel's not kicking back at me, and it feels like that electronic differential up front has got things pretty much under control. Select Sport and throw it into a couple of twisties, and it doesn't take long for you to realise that the Leon is very eager to play. I love the nose on this car. It's very, very accurate, very, very precise. Okay, the steering doesn't have quite the weighting that I would like, but I can place this car exactly where I want it, and there's plenty of front end grip as well. That electronic limited slip differential doing a really great job fighting any sort of understeer and really pulling the car closer to the apex of the bend. And you accelerate out, all that torque comes out, nice low revs, really strong performance from that engine, and the 7-speed dual clutch definitely keeps pace. I mean, manually selected, it's impressively fast as well. Something I really love is the chassis. It's very, very playful. I mean, you can really start to manipulate how it behaves through the way the weight transfers through the car. Start nibbling away at those brakes, big 370mm Brembos up front, tip the weight forwards, and the back end goes nice and light. And actually, especially in greasy conditions like this, lift off oversteer is aplenty. But it's that innate ability for it to really rotate itself round a bend that just makes it feel so agile. Now, it's maybe not quite as mobile as something like a Civic Type R, because it always has this really planted, connected feel with the tarmac. It's not battling the humps and bumps of the road. It flows and ebbs with the contours. It's nice. It's a car you can get into a real rhythm with. As a result, it might not be the out-and-out thrill that some other hot hatchbacks are, but it's a really good happy medium that this car's struck upon. I think it's definitely a more exciting, more engaging thing to drive than maybe even the GTI Clubsport. And the enthusiastic crackles and pops from the exhaust back there just serve to add more character to the experience. Now, going back into the mode selector, we can go along to a bespoke Cupra mode. Now, I don't know the exacting parameters of this, but the throttle is plenty responsive again. Things do still feel tight, but I wonder whether actually it's slackened off the suspension a little bit, because it's a really nice happy medium for these quite patchy roads. It's certainly an impressive hot hatch to drive at a pace, that's for sure, both in terms of its outright performance and the accessibility of that performance. Keen drivers might be left wanting by the steering though. There's just not quite enough communication coming through here, which is a bit of a shame. So that's the only real element of this car that I'm feeling a bit disconnected from. There are always two sides to the hot hatchback coin, the boy racer and those who have to race to get their kids to school. Thankfully, this car does have a bit of that duality. Okay, it rides a bit firmer than, say, something like a Golf GTI does, but it's not unbearable. The key to this is optioning DCC, or dynamic chassis control, because within this unfathomable touchscreen infotainment system is a series of selectable modes just for the adaptive dampers, ranging from rock hard to pillowy soft, and it just gives the car so much more range, a big breadth of abilities from when you're really on it to whenever you're on really patchworky tarmac. In comfort, the steering also becomes nice and light, which is ideal for town driving, parallel parking, navigating Tesco's car park, etc, etc. Also, the throttle response is dulled, so it's not quite so eager. It's not pulling at the leash anytime you're at a set of traffic lights. Cruising around town, things are actually pretty tranquil, but as you build speed and when you cruise on the motorway, there's a reasonable amount of road noise that begins to seep through and into the cabin. It's not outrageous, it's just not quite as refined as some competitors. Now, we've had all of the exciting figures such as 0 to 62s and top speed of 155 miles per hour, etc, etc. Time for some more grown-up numbers. Cupra reckons this car will do between 35 and 37 mpg with emissions of 171 grams per kilometre of CO2. Now, if you want the entry level of this fastest 296 brake horsepower car, that comes to £35,030, which, by my maths, is cheaper than a Golf GTI Clubsport. Food for thought. There is no getting away from the fact that the Cupra Leon is a fantastic addition to the hot hatchback fraternity. But the bigger question on your lips is probably, is it a better value for money Golf GTI Clubsport? And I suppose in some respects, pound for pound, yes it is. But more importantly, a Golf GTI is 10 a penny. They are everywhere. If you want something more distinctive, more unique, more personal, then maybe Cupra is your brand.